Great. Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference to discuss the economic and fiscal trajectory of Newfoundland and Labrador. Special thanks, of course, to Professor Locke, to the several organizers with CARE, with the Atlantic Institute for Policy Research, and Memorial University, also for ensuring this very high quality and seamless hybrid delivery of the event today. So I was asked to speak about the prospects for relying on Ottawa and reforms to fiscal arrangements and federal provincial transfers in particular to address the province's longer term fiscal challenges. And in order to do that, I think we need to turn our attention to the longer term prospects for the province. And by that, I mean 10 years into the future, 20 years, even 30 years into the future, by thinking about the challenges that build on what the minister so eloquently articulated just a moment ago. And that is, first, dependence on resource revenues and the potential future decline in those revenues, which I'll speak to in just a moment, combined with an aging and declining population and the resulting implications for healthcare costs, do introduce the prospect for rising public debt, but also because some of these challenges are shared by other provinces in Canada, there is an important role for the federal government that I'll try to unpack to provide that context and the sense of magnitude about what reforms might be available and how much of an impact might they have on the province's fiscal trajectory. Now, I'm going to focus on a few fiscal transfers, equalization and the Canada Health Transfer in particular, but also some other measures that may help increase provincial revenues, both in Newfoundland and Labrador and in other provinces. And by the end of the talk, I think the takeaway that I had in putting together this analysis was that a mixed approach is required. There is an important role for the federal government and for federal provincial transfers to be reformed, but also a role for provincial governments in Newfoundland and Labrador and elsewhere to take a look at revenue measures and efforts on the expenditure side to ensure that finances are sustainable in the long run. So let me just illustrate two of those major longer-term challenges for the province. First, from the Canada Energy Regulator's latest Energy Future report, their projection for oil production in the province by 2050 is for a pretty significant potential decline in oil production, especially after the middle of this decade. So after 2025, 26, as you can see, we are looking towards decreases in production that would significantly pressure the provincial budget because of declines in royalty revenues. What we're looking at here in the projection on the right in gray is just the baseline level of oil production that the Canada Energy Regulator's forecast has. And then in purple is a scenario that they ran under stronger climate action globally. So meeting global net zero goals by 2050 would result in a faster decline in oil production due to declining demand for oil and gas around the world. So, of course, this is not a foregone conclusion in the sense that innovations in the energy sector and the way in which oil is produced, lowering emissions while producing some of the resources in the province can result in future trajectories for production that are different than this. But this is clearly a challenge to consider very seriously. The second challenge involves the expenditure side of the provincial budget. Newfoundland and Labrador, like other jurisdictions in Canada and indeed many countries around the world, face the prospect of a pretty rapidly aging population. So here is Statistics Canada's one of their projection models showing that the share of Newfoundland and Labrador residents that are over the age of 65 may increase from 1/5 today to about 1/3 within 2 decades. And the share over the age of 80, in terms of the share of the population, may triple over that same time horizon. So this is not just an increase in the share of the population that is accounted for by older age groups, but it is an increase that is also more rapid than what we see in other jurisdictions in Canada. So here we're looking at the percentage point increase in the share of the population that is over the age of 65. And we can see that the pace of aging is roughly double in Newfoundland and Labrador compared to the rest of the country. This has a lot of important implications in many areas of the economic and fiscal trajectory of the province, of course. Older individuals tend to withdraw from the labor force as they retire. This has implications for economic growth as well. But the more direct implication for the budget involves healthcare spending. And I know others will speak to healthcare expenditure challenges and delivery later in the conference, but aging really mechanically creates cost pressures really just because of the graph that we're looking at here. The amount that is spent per person over the age of 90, for example, is in Newfoundland and Labrador approximately $40,000 per individual in that age group per year, which is an order of magnitude larger than the amount of healthcare spending accounted for by individuals in younger age cohorts. Now, of course, this too is not a foregone conclusion. As the minister so rightly put it, measures can improve health outcomes that can lower these bars that we're looking at here. But aging is a very real source of potentially significant cost increases just because as we age, the amount and complexity and expense of health treatments does rise. Now, using the population projection from Statistics Canada, combined with that health spending data that we just saw, the projection for average per person healthcare spending in Newfoundland and Labrador over the next couple of decades is for pretty significant increases. Just demographics alone look slated to increase real, like inflation adjusted per person health spending by about 40% by 2040. Now that 40% increase is fairly significant. Today it would represent roughly for the province about $1.3 billion today, or more than the entire revenue from the sales tax. So this is a significant expenditure challenge that, of course, other jurisdictions share, although the magnitudes are larger in Newfoundland and Labrador. In addition to demographic change, healthcare also tends to historically experience faster price increases than just the overall rate of inflation. And that's what we're seeing here, in addition to the green line projected forward from just demographics, but also about a 1% average health-specific rate of inflation, say. So I'll show you how all of these come together for the province's long-term fiscal trajectory. And I'll do that by looking at just net debt to GDP ratios over time. So this projection here is based on a detailed model of provincial and federal finances that disaggregates each province into a number of budget categories, forecasting tax bases and expenditure pressures going forward. All of this has been peer-reviewed and published and publicly available at Finances of the Nation, though what I'm presenting today is the most recent updated projections that incorporate some of the quite frankly positive developments in terms of energy prices that Newfoundland and Labrador, Alberta, and other energy producing provinces benefit from. But despite the increase in prices today, because of the potential declining royalties, and especially because of the healthcare expenditure pressures, the trajectory, just based on current policy, set it and forget it, for net debt to GDP is not sustainable, and that it is rising fairly continuously over time, although over the next year or two, the prospects for some modest declines. Now, this graph here, of course, just to highlight how royalties and healthcare pressures drive this, is the alternative trajectory for Newfoundland and Labrador debt levels if revenues kept pace with GDP. So if provincial revenues grew at the same rate as the overall economy over the coming years, then that trajectory while still unsustainable and growing over the long term, not nearly as rapidly. And if we remove demographic pressures from health cost growth, then you can see that sustainable finances would exist in the province in the sense that stable net debt to GDP is a sustainable fiscal position for a province. So this really shows us that the longer term challenges for the province really come from just these two factors of provincial revenue growth relative to GDP and demographic pressures in the healthcare system. Now, how large is this gap? It's one thing to look at two lines on a graph. It's another to kind of appreciate the magnitude of fiscal reforms, either revenue increases or spending decreases, that would allow you to move that red line to the blue. And it's roughly equivalent to 5.3% of the provincial economy. So this is typically referred to as a province's fiscal gap. So that's the analysis that I'll be presenting today. The Parliamentary Budget Office has several pieces of work on this as well. And that's really quite a large gap in the sense that 5.3% of GDP basically represents a little over 5 cents of every dollar earned throughout the provincial economy per year in terms of what the magnitude is of this longer term fiscal gap. Now, before I continue with exploring federal transfer reforms, just a caveat that, of course, these projections are sensitive to underlying assumptions. Interest rates being important for all jurisdictions, but more important especially for jurisdictions with higher levels of initial debt. And so, for example, if interest rates rise, then this challenge becomes even greater. And I think Professor Booth will be speaking to provincial bond markets and interest rates. So I won't try and unpack that further here, but do keep this caveat in mind that I'm basing what I'm presenting today on a particular scenario. And I don't want to hang my hat on any particular numbers. What I want you to take away from today's talk is a sense of magnitude and options. So prospects for federal transfer reform. So I'll go through several, and the guiding principles behind them will be that I want us to think about what I'm talking about here as working within the context of our current institutional and constitutional structures in Canada, and with the goal of aligning fiscal capacity with expenditure responsibilities. So in Canada, provincial governments are responsible for health, but there may not be, especially over the longer term, fiscal capacity that aligns with those growing pressures. Also, easing horizontal imbalances. So inequality across provinces has always been an important goal for the federal government to help bridge those gaps and supporting lower income regions, deliver the necessary public services. But I want to recognize that federal government, successive federal governments throughout Canadian history have rightly thought about transfer arrangements that don't expose the federal government to provincial policy choices. So I'll try to present reform options that respect that. So not just cost sharing directly with public service delivery at the province level. And the ultimate goal is to aim for sustainable debt to GDP trajectories. Now, there is a role for the federal government in the sense that their long-term fiscal position is fairly sustainable. If we plot, even with the increased COVID debt today, if we plot the federal debt to GDP ratio, it is gradually declining over time, but only gradually. So what we have here in this graph, if we want to get back to pre-COVID levels of debt, then the federal, within 25 years, then the federal government has about 0.3% of GDP in terms of fiscal room available to increase transfers to the provinces. Or if we want to accommodate some of the increased COVID debt, then it does have more room, but there's not a lot federally anymore just over the next couple of decades, just because of the large shock that we have experienced. But there is room, and I'm going to work within the room that we have available. In terms of horizontal imbalances, I won't dwell on this plot for too long, but today, right now, if we plot how equal federal transfers are across provinces, over time, we see that historically, prior to World War II, the level of inequality or differential treatment across provinces rose, fell during the war, and kind of gradually rose and fell after the war. But today, we have a very high degree of equality in federal transfers, certainly much more equal today than we have seen historically. And when we look forward, because demographics and how they're evolving is very different in different provinces, it does appear that over the next few decades, we may see rising levels of horizontal imbalances or differences across provinces. And that might motivate, or in a sense, I don't want to use the word ought, but just personally speaking, ought to motivate transfers that reflect different circumstances in different provinces. So let's dive into some details. I'll start with equalization. Looking at changes to the equalization formula and what that might mean for Newfoundland and Labrador. I'll look at changes to the Canada Health Transfer programs. This is by far the largest federal transfer program. And in particular, I'll look to changes to transfers that incorporate demographics in different ways, because that is the largest source of long-term cost pressure for Newfoundland and Labrador and for other provinces in Canada. And then time permitting, so we'll see where things get. I'll show you maybe some less likely but potentially interesting nonetheless, thinking out of the box potential arrangements. So first, equalization. COVID makes things really hard, of course, to predict, given how things can rapidly change from one week to the next. But current projections are from my own model here, and indeed the Parliamentary Budget Office as well. We'll, of course, see what happens, but it appears as though Newfoundland and Labrador may receive an equalization payment for 2022-23. There's still some dust left to settle in the coming months, but just given the scale of the COVID shock, I think that's more likely than not, and that's the first blip that we see on this graph. But longer term, as oil production declines occur, as economic growth rates decline also because of an aging population, it looks as though in the 2030s, perhaps the mid-2030s, Newfoundland and Labrador would then begin to receive on a more persistent basis payments through this program that rise gradually over time. But what are so this is under the current program. But what are some potential changes to the formula that would either increase or accelerate the timing of when those payments would occur? Well, I want to focus on a couple that have led to a lot of debate and discussion, certainly in policy circles and politically around the program that was introduced in 2007, reformed in 2009. First, called the fiscal capacity cap. And then I'll also talk about changes to the way in which resource revenues might be treated, other changes to the program, just to give you a sense of what the scale is for equalization to help address Newfoundland and Labrador's longer-term fiscal challenges. So to help us appreciate the program, let's look at payments this year. So what we're looking at with this table are the actual calculations behind the equalization payments to provincial governments in the current fiscal year. That first column there, the current formula, this shows Newfoundland and Labrador's non-resource fiscal capacity as calculated by the formula, the resource revenues as counted by the formula, and those combined, given all the way that they filter through the calculation that I won't get into, it leads to an entitlement of $563 million to Newfoundland and Labrador for the current fiscal year. But one feature of the program called the fiscal capacity cap essentially says that if an equalization receiving province would have a fiscal capacity after a payment is made larger than a province that did not receive a payment So for this year, the relevant one would be Ontario. Then there's going to be a clawback to the equalization payment to bring things down to that other province's level. And in Newfoundland and Labrador's case, that clawback is equivalent to about $846 million, leaving nothing and therefore no payment made for the current fiscal year. So redoing the calculation, removing that fiscal capacity cap, does result in an adjustment that I won't get into here, but a net payment for this current fiscal year of about $535 million. So that's one potential reform, and it comes up in conversations a lot, and this gives you a sense of magnitude about what that might mean for the province. Excluding resource revenues entirely, which is another proposal that has, I guess, been regularly considered, and over the years, reforms to equalization have excluded it, fully included it. This year we have some interesting partial inclusion of resource revenues, but if resource revenues were fully excluded from the program, then the payment for the current fiscal year to Newfoundland and Labrador would be about $556 million. So this gives us a good sense of scale. Long term, what that would mean is payments, if resource revenues were excluded, payments would begin essentially immediately and continue relatively indefinitely. So you can see that that would be a reform that would shift the timing of when payments would occur. And over the long term, payments would approach about 3% of overall GDP for the province. What that would mean for fiscal sustainability is it would lower that future net debt to GDP trajectory, although not by enough to fully solve the problem. And so this is an important takeaway, that even large reforms to an important transfer program are not alone sufficient to address the longer term challenges in the province. Other reforms to equalization, you could imagine making it larger. Right now, the size of the program is equivalent to about 0.8% of the national economy. Historically, it's been at levels in excess of 1.2%. So if we were to boost the size of the program to basically the limit of the federal government's long-term fiscal room, that would be boosting it by about 0.5% of GDP or so. That also would not quite be sufficient to alone address the longer term challenges in the province. So let's think about another policy. Let's introduce a reform that would exclude a province like Ontario from receiving equalization payments. So again, the details don't really matter for us today, but if we boost the size of the program and remove resource revenues, then Ontario does in this scenario here start to receive payments. But if we exclude them because they do have higher average individual incomes, then that would boost payments to other provinces. This is not historically unprecedented, but the late 70s, early 80s doesn't really matter for us right now. So here what we're looking at is basically the largest, what I think of as reasonably conceivable changes to equalization, even though I think completely unlikely and perhaps even not advisable, is also just not sufficient to address long-term challenges of Newfoundland and Labrador alone. So let's think about other potential reforms to transfer arrangements. Canada Health Transfer, we're seeing some interesting discussion about the pace of CHT growth during the federal campaign right now. Some have proposed increasing its growth rate by an additional roughly 2 points per year. Others in other years in the past have suggested other allocation rules to make the health transfer sensitive to provincial demographics, which is not currently the case. So what would that mean for the province? Well, if the Canada Health Transfer grows at 1% faster per year, it does help, but only modestly, very modestly relative to the longer term challenges. So the fiscal gap falls from 5.3 that we talked about earlier to about 4.9. If we grow CHT at 2 points per year, nudges down a little bit more. So those are not even close to addressing alone the long-term challenges for the province. What if we grew CHT at 2% and allocated it in a way that was sensitive to demographics? That appears to matter a lot more. So demographic allocation rules matters more for Newfoundland and Labrador in the long term than the actual total growth rate of the program itself. Okay. You can imagine combining this increased CHT growth, allocating based on 65 plus population shares, and removing resource revenues from the equalization. This is a combination that is also basically at the limit of the federal government's long-term fiscal room. And again, not quite sufficient for the longer term. So what about a transfer program that is new? Like, we're not reforming CHT or equalization, but we introduce a new transfer program that explicitly tries to address demographic related challenges of provincial governments. So just to make up a name that's clearly not catchy, but a CDT, the Canada Demographic Transfer. So equalization, it pays to provinces with below average fiscal capacity. So consider this as a transfer program that pays only to provinces with above average elderly population shares. Formula doesn't matter, but basically think of it as a payment made only to provinces who have the share of their population accounted for by those over the age of 65 as larger than the national average. And let's make this program as big as we possibly can to exhaust the longer-term federal fiscal room. That's roughly about 10 billion indexed to GDP over time. That would make a very significant dent in the long-term trajectory, but alone still not itself sufficient to address the long-term fiscal challenges. Okay, we could combine that, say, with removing resource revenues from equalization. This would also be feasible. And now you can see that here's basically, out of all the reforms I explored, and I had a lot of fun exploring quite a few of them, this kind of very, I guess, significant reform to equalization and very large scale and targeted demographic transfer, that's basically the only thing that would bring down the debt trajectory of the province to sustainable levels. Given the time, I won't talk about changes to kind of just region-specific transfers, although, of course, that's possible. But, so in my remaining 5 minutes, I guess the takeaway is that I want to provide in this last couple of slides here is that relying on just transfer reforms alone is not sufficient. And I summarize all of that here in this table. So remember the 25-year fiscal gap that we talked about. It's even larger if you look at a 50-year time horizon. That's kind of what we need to fill as provincial government. And most provincial governments have a fiscal gap of some amount or another, although Newfoundland and Labrador is a slightly larger than average. But the rows that follow, so these 5 rows below that top line, do show us the kind of contribution of federal transfer reforms relative to the overall fiscal gap. So basically, just a couple of reforms to CHT or equalization, or this new kind of harebrained, to be honest, demographic transfer, are on their own not quite sufficient, about half to 2/3 of the challenge. So the provincial government does have an important role to play both in Newfoundland and Labrador and elsewhere to ensure long-term sustainable finances, and that's to ensure that revenue grows with GDP and to help keep cost pressures down in healthcare. So removing that 1 percentage point average increase in health cost inflation. So some combination of increasing revenues with GDP through modest tax changes from one year to the next to offset the potentially significant decline in royalties in future years, combined with bringing health cost increases down. That right there, this gives you a sense of what provincial action can do on its own. And those I would characterize as fairly significant moves on both the revenue and the spending side that gets you almost all of the way there, but not completely. So those large-scale provincial actions combined with increasing health transfer growth and allocating based on demographics, now you're in the ballpark of long-term sustainable finances. So I'll conclude here. I see I have about 1 minute to go. So I'll just leave you with some concluding thoughts here that neither reasonable reforms to fiscal arrangements nor provincial fiscal choices are individually sufficient. There does need to be this mixed approach. I think that's not unique to Newfoundland and Labrador. Other provinces too will be looking to the federal government for changes to transfers. And I think where the focus should be going forward, especially because there's a real opportunity for consensus among provinces, is to put demographics at the center of transfer reform efforts going forward. And while equalization changes are tough, this is a program that changes regularly over time, as it should. And thinking about how longer term action on climate and energy transitions, how does that change the nature of royalty revenues in the future? Maybe that should motivate some discussion around equalization changes in the present for energy producing provinces to help them transition to this world where royalties are not as high as we've enjoyed historically. So some combination of provincial action, health spending restraint, federal transfer reform can ensure long-term sustainable finances both in Newfoundland and Labrador and throughout Canada. So thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, we'll take questions in the room and online if there are any. So if you're in the room, you can come to the microphone. Trevor, if you didn't hear, there was a pause for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question coming from the room.
Thank you, Trevor, for a great presentation. So I guess the long and the short of your presentation is that Newfoundland can't do it on its own, but it has to be part of the solution, right? Is that a reasonable?
I'd say that's a very fair.
You did a lot of machinations in order to be able to get it down to a reasonable level, right? And so what I took from what you had to say there was that there's a lot of things we have to do, but no matter what we do on our own, won't be sufficient to get to a sustainable level. Is that a reasonable characterization of what you said?
That is a reasonable characterization. I'd agree with that. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question on the floor here, I think.
Ever fancy, retired engineer and educator. Beautiful show. Yeah, I think if I were younger, I'd turn it into a video game. This question is not so much about the economics, but what led us to the economics. So it may not be in your area, but it certainly is in everybody in this room. A British lord once said that Newfoundland should be kept as a rock, a place to stand on, which means that we are only the ocean. The ocean is owned by the federal government. Most of our workers, or workers we used to have, but the workers we still have, go to work in a paramilitary organization. How does Newfoundland ever get control of its resources, which are the ocean? Not the pretty bogs and the pretty places, and that, but the ocean. Maybe somebody in the room would like to tackle that.
Yeah, that is definitely a difficult question that I will not weigh in on. I mean, here I am in Alberta, and so intense discussions around resource issues between the province and the federal government is, a part of our history as it is yours, and I think that's what makes Minister Cody's job quite a bit more difficult, and so I will defer to her expertise on this.
Thank you. Another question over here.
My name is David Vardy. I have a question. I enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was very realistic and extremely informative. I wanted to go back to your basic assumptions in terms of your the deficit you're projecting and the basis and the assumptions you made in making those projections into the future. And I'm curious as to whether you built in what assumption you made with respect to the Muskrat Falls project and its impact on our deficit, whether you've assumed that the cost recovery, the revenue requirements of Muskrat Falls are supported by utility revenues, or whether you assume that those costs would have to be borne by the Treasury. So my first question is how you treated those, and the second question I have relates to how would you, if you haven't included those, if you have assumed Muskrat Falls is utility supported, and if it isn't utility supported, how would that impact on your projections? And third question I have for you relates to whether you think that the cost of Muskrat Falls should be ring-fenced. Should it be dealt with in a separate way, or is there, apart from the fiscal impact on the province of recognizing that Muskrat Falls is not utility supporting, not supported by utility revenues, are there reasons to in terms of pricing of electricity, whereby you might consider not ring-fencing Muskrat Falls, but rather having the Treasury support those costs?
So that's a very important question. So thank you for asking that. Given that we're still awaiting some details, some of the nitty-gritty financial details around that recent deal, none of that is incorporated into these projections here. But part of what makes longer-term forecasting of this kind, and what's done by others, such as the Parliamentary Budget Office on a regular annual basis, easier, is that when you're looking over a 20, 30 or longer time horizon, even multi-billion-dollar short-term arrangements add up over that time horizon to, in the case of Newfoundland and Labrador and the Muskrat Falls, or the recent deal with the federal government, is effectively just a few tenths of a point to the overall fiscal gap estimates here. So when I say 5.2, 5.3, I don't want to hang my hat on that in terms of decimal places, but I do want to hang my hat on this, on the scale of the challenge and the magnitudes in broad strokes. And so I look forward to revising these projections as more information comes out, and that's certainly been the theme of the last year and a half, of continual revisions to all of these projections as new information becomes available.
Thank you. We'll take one more question over here. Yep.
Hi, Trevor. You alluded to this at the end of your presentation. Would you say that the current equalization formula has forced the hand of resource extraction economies to depend on volatile revenue streams? And would you say that the current structure is completely counterintuitive to lowering emissions? Newfoundland and Labrador has a plan to double down on oil production by 2030, and by all estimates, that is not going to allow us to reach those targets. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
So I think different resource producing regions have different constraints, different priorities that they face. And so I have very strong views, for example, around Alberta's choices with respect to resource revenues. I won't weigh in on Newfoundland and Labrador's historical choices around how to use resource revenues that flow in. But with respect to resources and equalization, that has always been a very difficult issue with no obvious correct way to treat it. There's strong arguments for excluding resource revenues completely, because it is very different from regular annual income flows from tax bases, consumption income, and property. But on the other hand, it is an important revenue source for provincial governments to deliver public services, and that motivates the inclusion of resource revenue. And so when the O'Brien panel, or the expert panel reviewing equalization, reported in 2006, it kind of split the difference between these two important considerations, and that's why it recommended a 50% inclusion rate. So I'd say that it's an entirely reasonable argument for someone to make to argue for the full exclusion of resource revenues, and there's trade-offs to that versus inclusion. And so I think this is an area where reasonable people can can disagree. Whether it's motivated provincial governments to rely on using resource revenues for program spending rather than accumulating in a savings fund, for example, that's an interesting empirical question that I don't think we have any good insight on.
And if it's a very quick question, we can take one more.
Sure, I'll try to be quick.
Yeah.
Just a quick question about how the assumptions are built around federal spending and fiscal room, which would be that I'm assuming this is kind of built on the current taxation structure, and it doesn't envision, for example, like there's a dialogue around wealth taxation right now, and if something like that were brought in, that would potentially up the federal fiscal room?
Precisely, and these projections are where current policy is pointed. And this is therefore not a prediction about where things are headed, because governments, of course, make changes from one year to the next, and reforms to taxes federally can absolutely increase the amount of room that they have available, for sure.
Excellent. Thank you again, Trevor, for joining us from Calgary.
Thank you.
And we'll move right on to our next presentation. After this one and the set of questions, we will have a short break as well.